Paul has a whole lot of good stuff to say, as he's been saying it. And I told you Galatians would be extensive and dealing with the Christian walk. And chapter 3 is not going to be any different. But chapter 2 he's talking about, as we are looking at again, verse 19 and 20. He's talking about issues surrounding the Mosaic Law. And he'll continue that in chapter 3. But again, to me, as I said before, Galatians is one of those books of the Bible that teaches us theology. And the basis of theology, this is where we get the foundation that we need to have. So these are very important chapters and words of Paul. Verse 19 says, "For though the law died, for I through the law died to the law, that I might live to God. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. The life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." So when Paul uses this phrases, there's a whole lot here. Some of it seems like a tongue twister maybe in some way. But if we look at it, he says, "For I, through the law, died to the law." What's he mean? He's making a very bold statement here. You got to remember who his direct audience is as well. You got to remember who he's talking around. Okay? Saying that he has died to the law. If he is dead to the law, then it's impossible for the law to be the way he stands accepted by God. Isn't that a question? Notice that it isn't the law that is dead. He doesn't say that. The law reflects in its context the holy heart and the character of God. That's the whole important thing here. There was nothing wrong with the law. That's not what he's saying. He didn't say there's something wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with it. It isn't the law that died. But Paul says he died to the law. So how did Paul die to the law? He says, "I through the law died to the law." The law itself killed Paul. Okay? It showed him that he could never live up to the law. You realize that, don't you? Isn't it interesting how we can find fault real quick with somebody because we don't take into consideration what Paul's saying right here? He's saying it showed him that he could never live up to the law. That's what he's saying. It fulfilled the holy standard for a long time. You got to remember, Paul tried to. He tried and he tried and he tried. The time before he knew Jesus, he tried to live up to the law. He thought God would accept him because of his law keeping. Unfortunately, many have the same approach today. It's not Mosaic law, but it's their own law. It's not even written. He came to a point where he really understood the law, and understanding it in a way as Jesus explained it on the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5 through 7. Paul realized that the law made him guilty before God. It's amazing he's dwelling on this. He was not justified before God through the law. The sense of guilt before God killed Paul. That's the idea of what he's saying. And made him see that keeping the law wasn't the answer. It wasn't the answer. So, should we pay attention to what Paul's trying to say here? And why?
Points to Jesus.
Okay? And why should we take into consideration what he has to say? Why should we take into consideration what Paul has to say?
Because the law can't save you.
Okay.
But Jesus can.
Sure. But why should we consider that?
Because there's only one way to heaven. There's not
But somebody else can say something different. So why should we consider what Paul's saying?
Because God said that.
It's the truth.
It is the truth.
Who was Paul?
Who was Paul?
Apostle.
Apostle of God. He was chosen by God out of
Okay, but we
from the other disciples.
Okay, so how would Paul understand the law?
He was a Pharisee.
There you go. He used to be one of them. He was a Pharisee. He was one that abided by the law. He's the one that tore down people and tore into people because of the law. So he found Jesus. So why should we consider what Paul has to say? Because he's living it. Because he's done it. He has seen it. He has witnessed it. Okay? So when we look at what Paul has to say, it is way beyond anybody's opinion that we hear today. That's the point. There's so many people that have opinions. There's so many people out here in the Christian realm putting in an agenda for us to listen to. Now I want to listen to what Paul had to say. To me, I want to hear what he had to say. Okay? He says very clearly, in this sense of the law, and he died to the law, that I might live. This is what he's saying. That I might live to God. These certain men, if you remember from last week, the certain men that was with James, they were not thinking or living as if they were dead to the law. So Paul is sharing something that's very profound to the Jewish mind. It's also amazing, we don't see it as well. When Paul died to the law, then he says he could live to God. As long as he still tried to justify himself before God by law keeping, he was dead. That's what he's trying to say. If we're trying to follow law keeping to get us to heaven, we're dead. He said, but when he died to that law, he became alive to God. So what does that mean? So when a person is a Christian, he is or she is above law and sin. When the law accuses that person, sin wants to drive the wits out of a person, and a Christian now has to look to Christ. Here's what Paul's trying to say. A Christian is free to be in a relationship with God. That's what's amazing. You're not bound by the law keeping. Doesn't mean you just do what you want. That's not what he's talking about. And we'll look at some more as we go on. We're not to think that the law is wiped out, because it isn't. It continues to operate, but he's saying the Christian is dead to that law, meaning we cannot find the way into heaven through the law if I abide by the law, because I can never fulfill the law, and I can't ever do everything in total as the law is given. That's why he's saying what he's saying. He says, I've been crucified with Christ. And again, Paul anticipates a question from those who disagree with him. And of course, you would have known, Paul, when did you die to the law? That would have been the question. When did that happen? You look like you're pretty alive right now. He says, I've been crucified with Christ. You want to know when I died to the law? He's basically saying, I died to the law when Jesus died on the cross. That's what he's referring to. See, this is theological stuff. How do we know that this is where we find our eternal life? How do we know this is where we find that salvation that we all come to talk about? This is here. Jesus died on the cross, so he says, I died with him, is what he's saying. He died in my place. He died in your place. It is, as Paul's saying, no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. Why would Paul make such a statement? Why would it be such a statement that Paul makes? It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Why is that an important thing to understand?